Did you know that the craziest social mobility system in the Middle Ages worked through attacks on children? The Ottomans launched a unique military conveyor in history. This machine was supposed to produce obedient fighters for the Sultan, but in the end, it created a force that no one could control. How was this closed, almost sect-like world organized from the inside? What kind of ordeal did a new recruit go through? How did he train? And who did an ordinary Janissary actually obey? Today, we're exploring the inner workings of the main military project of the East, from the very first day in the harsh training camp to the very end. Hello, this is Semyon, and you're watching the History Show channel. And here, we dig into the past without any boring lectures. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. Let's get down to business. Where did the Janissaries come from? Let's take a look at a 14th century map. Back then, the Ottoman Empire was a young and aggressive state startup. To the west, Byzantium was collapsing, and to the east, the Mongol Empire's remnants were fading. Plus, there were dozens of small Turkic principalities that sometimes fought against the Ottomans and sometimes formed alliances with them. There were no clear borders, and there wasn't really a classical army either. The main striking force of the Ottomans at that time were the Sipahis, heavy local feudal cavalry, excellent fighters, elite, but with a huge drawback. After all, each one had his own land and personal interests. Today, a Sipahi might fight for the Sultan, but tomorrow he could just ignore everything and go home to collect taxes from his own peasants. But the Sultan needed a tool that worked flawlessly and didn't ask unnecessary questions. So, as already mentioned, Byzantium was living out its last days next to the Ottomans. The empire had shrunk to just a few cities, but it was still fighting and still proud. During the clashes in the Balkans, the Ottomans regularly took such guys prisoner, and back then, prisoners were usually not treated gently. They were either executed or sold at slave markets as manual laborers. And at some point, the authorities suddenly had an idea. It's wasteful to kill or send disciplined and already tactically trained soldiers to hard labor. That's exactly right. They made the first Janissaries out of captured Christians. Hiring foreigners as personal guards is an ancient practice. If a guard doesn't know the language, isn't part of the nobility's circle, and doesn't get involved in palace intrigues, he's unlikely to stab you in the back. He simply doesn't have any other patrons here except his employer. Historians still argue about who exactly formalized this into a full-fledged system. The problem is that the Ottoman chronicles of the 14th century were written by guys from the late 16th century. That's why the creation of the corps is attributed either to Sultan Orhan or his son Murad I. Most likely the project was just being tested for years before it was finally put on paper. But whatever the case, by the middle of the 14th century, there was already a separate corps of Janissaries. In other words, a new army. And by the end of the century, they became the first real standing army in Europe. They were on a salary, lived in barracks, and trained all year round. No more seasonal gatherings and militias. For the late Middle Ages, this was an absolute breakthrough. But such a military apparatus required enormous human resources. And to solve this staffing issue, the Ottomans launched a non-stop pipeline that supplied them with recruits for the next 300 years. Devshirme, the blood tax. An ordinary day somewhere in the Balkans. An official arrives in the village with a stack of papers. He's not here for taxes. He doesn't need money or grain. He came to take the children. Officially, this procedure was called Devshirme, collection. But among the people, a darker name took hold, the blood tax. This mechanism was launched sometime at the end of the 14th century and applied exclusively to conquered Christians, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and Albanians. The empire pragmatically extracted the most valuable resource from the conquered territories, the healthy gene pool, the gene pool. They took one boy from every 40 households, although the number varied depending on the needs of the front. The age ranged from 8 to 18 years old. Perfect for brainwashing, they specifically targeted boys from villages. City boys were rejected immediately. It was believed they were too savvy and independent-minded. Street habits were not needed in the barracks. What mattered there was obedience and physical strength. By the rules, only sons were not to be taken. But this rule was often ignored locally. Sorting was done right there during the inspection. They assessed health, physique, and quick-wittedness. The most capable were set aside for the elite reserve. They were sent to palace schools to be trained as viziers, diplomats, and governors. The rest went to the infantry. After that, the boys faced a forced march to Istanbul. The inspector was personally responsible for each child. Any escape or death along the way meant the end of the escort's career, or even his life. At first, families reacted in understandable ways. There were attempts to hide their sons in the forest and to bribe the inspectors. Fathers would deliberately dress their children in rags to make them look sick. But over time, the system proved its effectiveness. It's important to note one key nuance here. The Janissaries were not classic slaves. Yes, their status as Qul meant complete subordination to the Sultan, but they had rights, a salary, and a career ladder. For a peasant teenager from the 14th century, this was the deal of a lifetime. And then an absurd turning point occurred. Now, some people, even Muslims, who were not affected by the Devshirme at all, started giving officials large sums of money just to have their children included in this very draft. Because the status of a Janissary provided stability, government funding, and real power. From a village boy to a soldier of the empire. What happened after the boys arrived in Istanbul? They were surrounded by a foreign language, a foreign religion, and a completely different world. At the first stage, no one sent them to the barracks to swing halberds. First, the boys were placed with Turkish peasant families in Anatolia for about 7 or 8 years. There, they plowed the fields, herded cattle, and chopped wood. They learned the Turkish language at the family table and Islam through daily life. A gentle reprogramming took place, and by the time they returned to the capital, the former Serbian boy was already thinking in Turkish and praying toward Mecca. Then the second stage of selection began, enrollment in the novice corps. That is the corps of novices. This is where the real military grind begins, lasting for 6 years. Combat, strength training, horseback riding, and a full arsenal every day. Discipline was maintained at a cult-like level. Overseers and eunuchs controlled every step. No women and no personal relationships on the side. Cadets lived and trained in small squads, ortas. The orta replaced the family, comrades in arms became brothers, and the commander became a father. By the way, it's time to debunk a common myth here. Popular culture loves to portray Janissaries as some kind of zombies with their memory completely wiped, who have forgotten their own mothers. That's absolute nonsense. There was no erasure of personality. The empire didn't need soldiers with amnesia. The guys remembered their roots perfectly well, where their home village was and what their father's name was. And that didn't stop them from fighting for the Sultan at all. In fact, it was quite the opposite. They still had a solid psychological anchor that kept them from completely losing their minds from the harsh barracks discipline. And the final touch, graduation. The cadets line up in front of their new commander. Each one received a certificate and a burk, that very same tall felt hat. A feather was attached to it depending on the rank. That's it. The very boy who cried on the road from his home village was gone forever. And in his place stood the perfect soldier of the empire. How did the Janissaries live in peacetime? Most of the time, the Janissaries actually didn't fight at all. Between campaigns, they would spend years sitting around in the barracks of Istanbul and other major cities. These barracks weren't located somewhere on the outskirts, but right in the center of the capital, right next to the Sultan's palace. They still lived in their traditional units, called ortas. The lifestyle was Spartan, almost monastic. Wooden bunks, a common dining hall, strict internal hierarchy, and regular training. The main fetish and sacred object for any Janissary was the regimental cooking pot, the kazan. It may sound funny, but for them, it was literally a holy relic. Once a day, the entire orta would gather around the pot to have something to eat, and this was the most important ritual of their warrior brotherhood. During parades, they carried the kazan with such pride as if it were the Ark of the Covenant, and to lose the cauldron in battle was considered a disgrace and led to the disbandment of the unit. But if the Sultan started tightening the screws or delaying their pay, the Janissaries would go out to the parade ground and demonstratively turn their cauldrons upside down. And the Sultan immediately understood that trouble was brewing and a military revolt had begun. And the Janissaries would return to this gesture more than once in Ottoman history. And what about the money? The salary was paid 3 or 4 times a year. They paid so well that even an ordinary Janissary felt like a big shot compared to a regular Ottoman worker. At the same time, the state covered all their basic needs for food, housing, and free healthcare. And at the end of their service, they received an excellent pension. For the 14th to 16th centuries, this was simply a fantastic benefits package. Plus, there was one tradition that made the Sultan's eyes twitch: the accession bonus. Every new ruler was required to give the army a huge bonus, which can be seen as buying their loyalty. If the treasury was empty, the sultans would go into crazy debt just to pay the infantry, because if you didn't pay, they would turn over the cauldrons. In peacetime, the Janissaries worked as something like a combination of city emergency services and special forces. They put out fires, they patrolled the markets, they chased bandits and guarded officials. At the same time, the corps was completely autonomous. They had their own blacksmiths, armorers, and even their own cooks. And now to the most interesting part, the ban on having a personal life. Initially, it was strictly forbidden for a Janissary to get married, because a soldier monk has no vulnerabilities, he can't be blackmailed, and he has nowhere to spend his resources except on military service. But the plan started to crack. In the 16th century, the restrictions began to loosen. At first, top officers were allowed to have families. The ban was also lifted for regular soldiers. By the 17th century, a married Janissary became completely normal, and then consequences appeared that the creators of the system hadn't foreseen. After all, a married soldier starts thinking about his children. He wants to get his son a comfortable position with a good government allowance. As a result, the ideal military machine, originally designed as a counterbalance to the local elites, itself turned into a fat hereditary caste. Janissaries on the battlefield always stood strictly in the center. Light cavalry rushed along the flanks, causing confusion, breaking the enemy's formation, and drawing them into the center, where the Janissaries would then take over. They stood as a solid block, waiting for their moment under the psychedelic thunder of the military orchestra. First, they mowed down their opponents with bows, then with crossbows, and at the turn of the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman infantry switched to firearms. For the time, it was a huge risk. Early arquebuses were temperamental, took a long time to reload, and in the rain, they turned into nothing more than a useless metal stick. While Europeans thought it was crazy and stuck to their crossbows, the Janissaries placed their bets on firearms and hit the jackpot. By the beginning of the 16th century, they had honed their arquebus skills to an esports level. They could shoot on the run, reload with one hand, and deliver insane rates of fire. European generals wrote about this in their reports with quiet horror. At the same time, they had a real hang-up about melee weapons. The Janissaries absolutely despised pikes. In their view, stabbing the enemy with a long stick from behind someone else's back was the act of cowards. A real fighter should look his opponent in the eye. That's why in close combat, they used sabers and their signature blade, the yataghan. The tactic worked flawlessly, but every overpowered strategy eventually comes to an end. By the end of the 17th century, Europe had learned from its mistakes, switched to linear tactics, strict fire discipline, and a new regular infantry. And this was only the beginning of the end. The Golden Age and the beginning of transformation. Every powerful structure has its own historical peak. For the Janissaries, this golden age came during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 20,000 elite professional killers. They take Belgrade, take Rhodes, and terrorize Vienna. Salaries are paid on time, discipline is strict, and the Devshirme system reliably supplies the best Balkan boys. It seems like a perfect machine. But in 1594, a fatal crack appeared in the foundation. The Ottomans officially allowed freeborn Muslims to join the corps. A nice excuse to let the sons of old Janissaries continue their father's work, but in reality, they were shooting themselves in the foot. After all, the concept of Devshirme was based on taking people without connections, those who had no clan, no land, and no protection. But the son of a Janissary, that's already nepotism. He has a father who can put in a good word for him. He has relatives, neighbors, and business interests. The social isolation that was the whole point of it all went straight into the trash. And it got even worse. By the 17th century, a Janissary's badge became a VIP pass to a better life, steady money, tax benefits, and judicial immunity. Naturally, everyone wanted to get into this exclusive club. Officers simply started selling spots. Merchants, craftsmen, and minor officials were added to the Corps' roster in droves. People bought status, received a government salary, and never once held a musket in their entire lives. By the middle of the 18th century, there were 110,000 men on paper, but in reality, only a handful of them were actually combat-ready soldiers. The Devshirme system simply quietly died out. There was no need to kidnap anyone in the Balkans anymore. There was already a line of people wanting to buy a position that stretched for miles. The result is predictable. When elite special forces turn into a corrupt gravy train, military training goes down the drain. New soldiers joined for the benefits, not to die for the empire. Veterans watched this circus in horror, but the brakes had already failed. The Corps was rapidly losing combat effectiveness, but at the same time was gaining enormous political weight. The Janissaries stopped being an army and turned into a heavily armed mafia. And what happens when the mafia has the keys to the capital, we will soon see. The Janissaries as a political force. At some point, the Sultan stopped being the Janissaries' boss and turned into an annoying obstacle that could simply be eliminated. The first serious crash test of the system happened in 1622. The 19-year-old Sultan Osman II was an ambitious and capable young man. He realized that his personal guard had turned into the main threat to the state. That's why he planned to raise a new army in the east and disband this bloated corps once and for all. But the Janissaries found out about the reform before the Sultan could do anything. They dramatically overturned the cauldrons. Returning during the day, the armed crowd goes to storm the palace. Osman tried to disguise himself as a merchant and escape quietly, but it didn't work. He was caught and strangled. For the first time in the history of the Ottoman Empire, the reigning ruler was disposed of by his own guard. And after Osman, there was a real conveyor belt of coups. They didn't always end in death. Sometimes the ruler was simply politely but firmly asked to leave or placed under house arrest. Until the very end, this mechanism worked like clockwork. There was always a reason to overturn the cauldrons. The Corps would issue an ultimatum, and the palace would capitulate. The uprising of 1730 was a real masterpiece of political maneuvering. It was the so-called tulip era. It sounds beautiful. It smells of art and cultural renaissance. But in reality, the empire is losing wars. The economy is plunging into an abyss, and the capital's elite are obsessed with European trends, which drives conservatives crazy. The Janissaries skillfully rode this wave of hate. They made some random retired soldier, Patrona Halil, who used to sell junk at the market, the formal leader of the revolt. In days, he drew thousands, overthrew Sultan Ahmed III, and installed his puppet, Mahmud I, as ruler. By the way, later Mahmud got rid of Khalil, who had gotten out of control, and his followers. By the end of the 18th century, the Janissaries had turned into full-fledged states within the state. In the capital, they controlled entire districts according to their own rules and pushed their people into ministerial positions. And in the regions, Janissary garrisons actually evolved into autonomous criminal groups that terrorized the locals and openly defied the central government. In 1789, yes, exactly when the revolution broke out in France, Selim III ascended the throne. The man decides it's time to put an end to this circus and launches the Nizami seeded program, the New Order. His plan was to assemble a proper European army with up-to-date tactics and competent officers. Selim didn't rush things and built this structure in parallel with the Janissaries, carefully allocating a separate budget for it, but it didn't work out. In 1807, another rebellion broke out. The official reason for the uprising was quite trivial. It's funny. The Janissaries were asked to change into European-style uniforms. You'd think, what's the big deal? But the leadership of the Corps wasn't made up of fools. They understood perfectly well. Today you put on a European uniform, and tomorrow you're marching by European regulations under the orders of new commanders. That's why the cauldrons were thrown to the ground again. Selim was forced to abdicate, and a year later he was strangled in the same prison where Osman II had once been strangled. History repeated itself almost exactly 200 years later. But this time, the system suffered a fatal failure under the new Sultan, Mahmud II. The auspicious incident of 1826. Mahmud II was a man with nerves of steel. When you see your predecessor being strangled in a prison cell before your eyes, you learn the rules of the game very quickly. Mahmud took the throne in 1808, and for many years he pretended to be the Janissaries' best friend. He paid them on time, showered them with benefits, and smiled sweetly at parades. And in the shadows, he quietly and methodically prepared their complete destruction. First, he won over the ulama, the highest Islamic scholars, to his side. This took away the Janissaries' favorite trump card, since they could no longer hide behind the protection of traditional Islam whenever there was trouble. The clergy was now playing for the Sultan. At the same time, Mahmud was strengthening the army. Quietly, he placed his own people in key positions, set up posts, and poured money into artillery and technical military units, where the influence of the Janissaries was almost zero. He created new units under neutral names and made no loud announcements. The experience with Selim showed how a flashy presentation of reforms could end. In May 1826, the trap snapped shut. The Sultan announces the creation of new infantry units with European training and suggests that the Janissaries provide 150 men from each orta to exchange experience. The Janissaries reacted exactly as Mahmud had expected. On June 15, the cauldrons were thrown to the ground and the armed crowd moved toward the hippodrome. They were expecting the classic outcome. We'll show our strength now. The palace will get scared, roll back the reforms, and even give us more money. But this time, the script broke. Mahmud unfurled the green banner of the Prophet, an absolute sign of an emergency threat to the state. The ulama publicly support the Sultan, and ordinary residents of Istanbul take to the streets, but not for the Janissaries, against them. The city was so tired of their racketeering and lawlessness that the townspeople themselves took up arms and went to finish off the former elite. And then the cannon spoke. The Sultan had moved artillery to the Janissary barracks in advance. When the shelling began, the rebels realized they were trapped. Those who tried to escape ran into the enraged crowd of townspeople, and those who stayed inside burned alive. As a result, between 4,000 and 10,000 were killed. On June 17, 1826, the corps was officially erased from history. The very word Janissary was banned, the barracks were demolished, and the archives were burned. Legacy. The main historical paradox of the Janissaries is that they both created the Ottoman Empire and buried it. Without this regular army in Europe, the Ottomans would never have taken Constantinople and would not have become the hegemon of Eurasia. But these same ideal soldiers, having turned into an untouchable mafia, completely strangled any attempts by the country to modernize. While Europe was making technological and military breakthroughs, the Janissaries were killing reformist sultans and dragging the state back into the Middle Ages, causing the empire to fall catastrophically behind. And yet, behind the grand politics, bloody coups, and harsh Ottoman legacy, lies the story of thousands of those very peasant boys who for 300 years in a row were taken from their homes. They were forged into blind weapons. They survived in barracks, grew old in foreign lands, and took everything they could from this harsh system, while the system squeezed them dry. Well, that's all I have. If you like the topic, subscribe to the channel, and give it a like. That's how the algorithms know we're making good content. And see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone.